Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Utah's legislative session is underway and already moving at a breakneck pace. Which issues are at the forefront? What bills are leaders pushing? And how are citizens making their voices heard? The federal government is open for business, for now. Who did Utahns blame for the partial shutdown? How do they want the debate over immigration and border security to proceed? And what is being done to prevent another government shutdown?
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Doug Wright with KSL, Julia Ritchey, political reporter with KUER, and Matt Canham, managing editor for the Salt Lake Tribune. So glad to have you all with us on the show. Let's jump in. So many things happening in politics and in the state of Utah. Doug, we're going to start with you. This week, the governor delivered his State of the State address. Right. What he gets to do every year, talk about what he thinks is going well and some initiatives. You've had a chance to watch a lot of these from many governors. Give us a rating on this particular State of the State and some of the kind of the themes that you saw.
It's a good solid B. I've noticed Governor Herbert become much more relaxed, and I think some of it is now that he's in the final stages probably of his active political career, at least in elective office. I've noticed a lightening up a little bit, but also a focus. I think this time he seems comfortable. He seems very comfortable in the shoes that he's standing in behind the podium. I think he's comfortable in addressing the legislature. Several things intrigued me. First of all, he is the #1 salesman for the state. He is the cheerleader for Utah. There's no doubt about it. And I always enjoy that about Governor Herbert. But also this time, he's really focused on the quality of our air and some ways to do it. We've heard this for years. What about the quality of the air? What are we going to do? Well, we're beginning to see some direction, at least from the state level. I'm also intrigued with the sales tax decrease, and that's something that I hope we can get into here.
Well, let's jump into a couple of these. Julia, there were some specifics that we were waiting for. We see the governor's budget in December. One of those, let's do an order that Doug just talked about, $100 million for air quality. We finally got some specifics on what he wants to do with it.
Right. So we know he wants to help replace some of those wood stoves, replacing gas-powered lawnmowers and leaf blowers. So we actually got more details than we usually get in a State of the State. I was kind of, I thought it was remarkable that he had this sense of urgency that I thought was lacking last year, where because it is his maybe next to last year before becoming a lame duck governor, we got a laundry list of things that he wants, including that big tax cut.
On that air quality issue, you're interviewing lots of people, and on the Hill, this is not something you always see a Republican governor talking about. Right. How is this being received by legislators on the Hill?
I've been kind of curious about like the impetus for this, but I really do believe because Salt Lake is in the running for another Winter Olympics in about 10 years, there is that sense of urgency that we need to do something to both, protect our climate here, but also make it hospitable if we're going to host another big games like that. And so reducing carbon emissions is a big part of that, and he has a goal, I think, of a 25% decrease in carbon emissions.
It also comes to businesses that want to relocate. We'll also talk a lot about air quality, or people who are living here who are thinking about what they're going to do with their careers. If they have a health situation, it could be a factor. Brad Wilson, the new House Speaker, one of his kids has asthma. And so he feels that when those inversions happen, so it is something that affects a lot of people. Beyond the incentives to get rid of lawnmowers, which I think that's something I should probably get on this year.
I have a push mower, so
that would be the way to go.
I'm impressed.
They're also talking about, the state fleet and the efficiency of state buildings. The state is a huge employer, and they can impact this by increasing, those who telecommute. So they're going to try to do that and then try to get other businesses to get on board. If they actually spend up to $100 million, we'll see, but it is a more concrete effort than we have seen in the past.
Not only the Olympics and not only some of the other things that have been mentioned here, but when we're looking at our population doubling by 2050, even with Tier 3 fuels, even as we all buy new vehicles that hopefully are considerably better, like Tier 3 vehicles as it were, that's supposed to really dramatically help. And when the majority of our small particulate pollution is coming from our tailpipes, second is the smokestacks out of our homes and our furnaces and water heaters, and third is industry. I think that's why there's such a focus, because even with all of these things that are being accomplished, and some are happening naturally with the switches to fuels and so on, but with the population of the state doubling, that's a factor, and we want the state to grow. But wow, that's a real challenge.
But I think we should mention that the majority of Americans believe in climate change, and so it's not been a very winning issue for Republicans to keep their head in the sand about it. So I think you are seeing the public opinion shift, and you're seeing the Republicans following that shift.
Well, Mitt Romney kind of made that cool. Remember, he, I was country before country was cool. He was a climate change guy before it was cool in the Republican Party. He said, I, for one, am a Republican who does believe in climate change, and I believe that humankind plays a role in it. That was a tectonic shift.
Big statement at the time.
Yeah.
All these changes that we talked about, particularly, Matt, let's get into some of those things you talked about that the governor has at his disposal, particularly with the government and the running of it. It all takes money. And I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are about the governor's approach to this, because he announced, kind of right along with Brad Wilson, the Speaker of the House, a $225 million reduction in the sales tax.
That would be the biggest tax decrease in our state's history, and I think that marker on his resume is something that's attractive to a governor who's near the end of his term in office. And it's also about a shift in how we tax. Right now, there's lots of services that you don't pay a tax for. Let's say if you have someone come and mow your lawn, or what's another example? Liposuction, or any medical procedure, really. If you need a lawyer for anything, you don't pay tax.
Things like
Carpet cleaning is another example. I shouldn't say this, but newspaper subscriptions are an example. Now,
We'll keep subscribing.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, here's the flip side. If you try to tax everything, every one of those people, the medical professionals, the lawyers, the newspaper publishers, will come and defend and say this is why this shouldn't be taxed. And that's why this is such a big, hefty political lift. The way you sweeten it is a tax decrease, a tax reduction. That's how you make it something that is worth it to a politician to go through what will probably be a very painful exercise. The other thing I would point out is doing this in 45 days is hard. And I would say, if I had to guess on whether this is successful or not this session, I'd put it at less than 50%, because every one of those lobbying groups are going to come out and defend their tax exception or exemption, and getting that done while you're trying to get the rest of the business of the state done, that's just a heavy, heavy lift.
I was mentioning this prior to us going on the air here and speaking with Jason, but I look at my mother. She's 90 years old now, and she lives primarily off services. And occasionally she'll make a purchase, often it's small, but her big expenses are services. People coming into her home, providing services and so on. I wonder how we get, especially with our senior citizens, how we make that equitable for them, because many of the things that we have mentioned here, they are primary consumers of. You look at the medical things, you look at kind of traditional old school services, mowing the lawns, having the carpet cleaners come in, they hire that done. So for my mother, and I think AARP would probably agree on this, there could be a real disproportionate wallop for our senior citizens.
It's a very interesting point. Julia, if you start looking at these implications, because the governor says, this is the phrase, right? You broaden the base, you lower the tax, right? So, he even made some kind of funny statement, we still tax buggy whips in his speech. He's talking about an outdated tax code, but does that compensate? If we reduce the rate, but we're still starting to have these impacts that we were not used to paying, is there still a disproportionate hit to those that may be using the services the most?
Right. So he is worried about regressive taxes and how those will disproportionately affect lower income. So he says he's open to things like lowering income tax, which we already have, I think, like a 4.95, pretty low rate, but doing an earned income credit. The issue is there just haven't been a lot of specifics yet. We have 2 Republican lawmakers working on the big bill that would look at what would be taxed and who gets taxed, but we don't really know yet. And even though he mentioned rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft already has a sales tax agreement with the state. So it's really unclear how much more. But Phil Dean, who's with the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, said if you got rid of all of the sales tax exemptions that are currently in existence, you would actually lower the rate to below 4%, which is what he's aiming for. He said he wants it even below that, below 2%. But again, those people, all of those exemptions have lobbies that go with them.
They always do, don't they?
Right.
Well, I want to keep on the money theme for a moment, too, because even as we're talking about lowering the tax rate, Matt, we're still talking about Medicaid expansion.
Yeah.
So let's get into how these two play together a little bit and maybe tell us what's happening with that bill that just came out of the Senate this week.
Yes. So last January, and correct me if I get this wrong, but last January, the legislature passed a limited Medicaid expansion up to 100% of the poverty level and added a work requirement. So the people who get it have to at least prove that they're attempting to find work. There's a limited exceptions for certain people. To get that, they needed the Trump administration to provide a waiver. The Trump administration did not. The initiative went forward. There was a much more robust expansion. It went up to 138% of poverty. I believe that's an extra 40,000 people that would get access to Medicaid insurance. And that passed with about 53% of the vote. The legislature said, let's go back to our plan in January, almost roughly the same. The one thing that they're keeping is the tax increase that voters passed for. Right. That part, they agree, is the will of the people. The actual level of expansion, they are debating whether that actually the voters really wanted to do what the voters agreed to do.
Well, Julie, you've been on the Hill a lot. The protests, people are on the Hill.
Yeah, this defies logic. I mean, it passed initially in the Senate. It will have to come up for another Senate and House vote, obviously. But 7 senators or 8 senators in districts where Medicaid expansion passed voted against or voted to repeal portions of the bill. And that makes no sense at all, because if you're saying you're with the will of the people and you're actually voting against what your constituents voted for, it makes no sense. And it's all, as he said, predicated on receiving federal waivers from the Trump administration that have yet to be approved. We have no idea who in the Center for Medicaid and Medicare are talking to our senators about this. So it's just a big gamble. But Senator Christensen says that it's a gamble he's willing to take.
He does. Now, Doug, you have people are talking to you about this every day, right?
Well, I kind of came loaded.
You've got notes.
And a few more. No, these are not notes. These are questions.
Oh, okay.
I had the opportunity to moderate a town hall meeting right at the beginning. It was last week, just at the beginning of the legislative session. I've done it for years. The legislators in our area, that includes Cottonwood Heights, Holiday, Murray, Mill Creek, and some of Salt Lake City. And we had 5 of our elected representatives there. And they always ask folks to just give me the 3x5 cards, and you kind of do a quick distillation, and then you ask the questions on their behalf. It's an interesting process. Normally, we see education. The stack is the biggest for education. Then it's usually tax issues and so on, then kind of a smattering. This year, I was really quite stunned. It's all about the propositions, primarily about the Medicaid expansion, Proposition 3. But all of the props were brought up. And I heard things like this, and we distilled it into several different questions, but I'd like to know the process and reasoning behind the legislative changing of our propositions. Then this one, and I may need my glasses for this because we have some small writing on here I hadn't anticipated, but it said there were propositions passed by the majority of voters in November, but now the legislature seems to be modifying or overturning these propositions. How is this possible? And every one of these deals with this. And I've never seen anything quite like it. And people really are. First of all, the process, it was explained by one of our legislators that basically a proposition carries about the same weight as legislation. So it can be overwritten. And you've been in the governor's office, so you know that. And so, but it's the expectations of the voters.
Right.
Because this helped to bring out, along with some other things, some really unprecedented numbers of people participating in the process. They were passionate, they were involved. The legislature, since vouchers were overturned, has made it much more difficult than it used to be to get something on the ballot. It takes Herculean efforts and big money. So they're not only wondering about that, they're wondering whether the legislature now is going to not only modify what they did or overturn what they did, if they are also going to now make it more punitive and make it more difficult to get something on the ballot.
We do have some bills already looking at that.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the disconnect that still exists between the citizens and the legislature. You would think after having 3 ballot initiatives even make it to the ballot that the legislature would be a little bit more receptive to what the public is telling them and what the public wants. And so while this Medicaid rollback is under the guise of fiscal conservatism, we are actually asking to pay more as a state initially than what was even passed in the expansion. I think people are paying closer attention to these issues, and so they can call the legislature's bluff a lot easier than they used to.
Okay, I'm gonna follow the call the bluff analogy just a little bit, because I want to talk about what's happening in Washington, D.C. The government is now open. All right?
For now.
Temporarily.
For now. Yeah. We have 2 weeks left on this compromise, right? As they start trying to negotiate what they're going to do. And let me read a quote to you from Mitt Romney about what he thinks happened, and let's see if you think it's having the right impact. Mitt Romney said, "The decision to reopen government for 3 weeks basically says to the Democrats, okay, now put up or shut up." So the president calls their bluff. That was your lines there. And says, okay, we'll open the government. Now it's your turn to actually come up with a deal that helps us secure the border. Now, Matt.
That's not how poker works.
Oh, okay. That's not how it works. Okay.
No, I mean, the president folded because he didn't have a good enough hand to play the game. That's what happened. It's not calling a bluff. He put his cards down. He said, I'm going to keep the government shut down until I get the border wall money. Congress, he didn't have the votes. Congress didn't do it. He put his cards down and said, okay, fine, open up the government. But let's play another hand. His hand didn't get any better. Nothing changed for him. There's no incentive for Congress to now give him that money again. And even this week, he had a tweet saying that the border wall is being built and I don't really need you guys' help. And so it's mixed messages for the congressional negotiators. When it gets to February 15th was the next deadline, I don't know why, if you were a person who wasn't voting for border wall money, you would suddenly vote for border wall money. You know, like, I don't know what changed for you that this would be worth it. And, you know, well, it might be different in Utah. Nationally, the president was taking the brunt of the criticism. And once again, it's his request that is the holdup. Congress can just pass a budget, and it's the president who's the one that's forcing a shutdown.
Julia, to use Matt's analogy there, the opening bid was 0 from the Democrats this week, right?
The analogy I saw on Twitter was Trump is playing checkers while Speaker Nancy Pelosi is playing chess, right? So she's got a lot more maneuvering power at this point. But I think it speaks to the reality that President Trump is unwilling and unable to deal or cope with the realities of divided government.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that we've been looking at, and we did this with the Salt Lake Tribune, was a poll as to who Utahns think are to blame for this shutdown. It's interesting. 43% of Utahns blamed President Trump. 44% blamed the Democrats. 3% blamed the Republicans. Doug? So Republicans are skating on this one. Just seems like two groups kind of in the crosshairs on this.
Yeah, and they shouldn't be skating because this is a failure of Congress on both sides. Congress needs to take the reins in their hands. They need to steer this. Congress has been abdicating its responsibilities now for years and years and years. And when people complain about executive overreach and legislative overreach or legislating from the bench, that's because Congress isn't doing their job. I'm sorry, that's just the way I see it. If Congress was acting under the Constitution and exercising their constitutional powers, we wouldn't be having some of these problems. And so the Republicans can't and should not be allowed to skate on this. Congress as a whole harbors a real responsibility here. I think it's 50-50. I think the president and the Congress, they need to step up. I don't know when we weaponized the budget. And now we bludgeon each other. There used to be lively fights over the budget. The purse strings are very important. There are some leveraging things that can happen here. But weaponizing the budget, this is a relatively new thing that started in the late 1970s. And now we've got it down to the art of war. And it's working to the disadvantage of the country. And can I just throw out one thing that has made me crazy in this whole conversation? I was in Hawaii anticipating what the president was going to say, that he had this plan and so on. And he said, basically, you build my wall, I'll give you the DACA kids. That just drove me insane. The DACA kids should not be used as a pawn in this nasty weaponizing of the budget. It's reprehensible.
Julia, to this point, and all the proposals that have come out since government reopened, the DACA issue has not even been on the table.
Right. I don't know. There wasn't that much difference between what Democrats and Republicans wanted. It really came down to President Trump reneging on his agreement last year to put Dreamers and create a pathway not to citizenship, but at least to extend that program that he had pulled the plug on, and he pulled out of that agreement. And so I think what we have, and I'm all about the both sides thing, but in this case, I really do think President Trump has gone back on his word over and over again on what he wants, and it has placated hardliners in his party and hardliners on Fox News, and so that is why we can't reach an agreement right now.
And the Senate abdicated to the president. Right. Mitch McConnell is following what the president's lead is on this negotiation, which means when you talk about Congress, sometimes, especially after the last election where the Democrats took the House, maybe your average voter out there might think Congress is now in the hands of Democrats. One, the House is, not the Senate.
Right.
So when you say Congress is to blame, that is a both parties problem.
It is, absolutely.
But the Senate's the one that says we're not going to vote unless the president agrees to it, at which point they're abdicating their congressional responsibility to the executive. That is where the failure is coming through.
So what are you seeing right now from the president's office in terms of his options, right? He keeps dangling at least one out there.
Which is the declaring an emergency. It's hard to argue that he's been in office for 2 years. He campaigned before that for 2 years on this. And
Mexico paying for the wall.
And that now it's the emergency. And so there are people who are concerned that might not hold up in courts because it's hard to defend that with the circumstances of which we've seen. But he might try it because it doesn't appear that I don't see how he gets $5.7 billion from Congress. He doesn't have the votes. And this is one thing I would want to really quickly point out. Every president loses. Right? Every president loses a big initiative. Clinton lost health care. George W. Bush lost immigration. He lost privatizing Social Security. On the first day in office, President Barack Obama signed an executive order to close Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is still open. He didn't have the votes. Congress defeated all of those presidents. Congress right now is defeating this president, and at some point, either they are going to have to, some dynamic's going to have to change, or he's going to have to accept that reality.
Can we talk about the emergency for a second? I've seen so many Oval Office speeches, and they are serious business. I mean, they've the Cuban Missile Crisis to Berlin. I mean, you name it. And again, are we going to weaponize that now? Is this something you mentioned? Will the courts, will the judicial hold up this emergency? I would ask, will the American people uphold this emergency? I respectfully ask, where is the emergency? Other than emergencies that have been created by the president and the Congress.
Well, the president has confused two very distinct issues, which is border crossings are all-time low.
Yeah.
So there isn't really a case to be made at this point for additional fencing, maybe reinforcing the fencing or barriers that are already there. The real crisis is in the families from Central America who are actually entering the country through legal ports of entry and seeking asylum. That is where the real crisis is, and that is where Democrats and Republicans agree that more immigration judges and more border enforcement officers could help. But because President Trump is confused over this very issue that he's made a signature part of his campaign, he's unable to break his own impasse. So
let's talk about the implications at home, because you start talking about who's got the votes. Matt, let's talk about this poll we did recently about how Utahns feel about the president and his actions. And one in particular, in the question that we asked together, the Hinckley and the Tribune, is if the 2020 election were held today, would you vote for President Trump? And interestingly, 41% of Utahns say they would definitely or probably vote for him. 54% said they definitely would not.
Right. Well, in 2016, I believe that the president got 45%.
45 in Utah, right.
Yeah. So it's a little lower, but his staying power has been impressive.
Yeah.
You know, no matter what's going on in the country, he's roughly about in that, you know, high 40s, low 50s in Utah approval rating. The one thing about our poll is we don't put them up against anyone, and so there's no one else that's getting the bat taken to them. But it's a bad sign in a state like this when you have a president this unpopular. It's been the same, and he has not been able to change those numbers, and I also don't think he's attempted to. He is a president who has played to that base and has not looked to expand his approval among other groups.
Hey, Julia, this is not uncommon to see presidents kind of have these ebbs and flows, right? How important for this next election is that border wall?
I don't know, honestly. I wish I had better predictions at this point. But it has opened up an opportunity for an inter-party challenger on the Republican side to challenge Trump. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw someone try to primary him in 2020.
Okay, so we may see that, but we see some interesting Democrats coming forward as well. Doug, I'm curious what you think about this Howard Schultz, the old CEO of Starbucks.
Well, it's interesting because he's basically saying both parties are not doing their jobs. They're not watching out for the American people. And I think in many regards, he's right. Plus, the number of Americans who do now say they affiliate with a party versus that don't, it's amazing. If somebody could energize that middle, we might have an interesting scenario. Whether we'd have a winner, but it could change the game.
Could change. Very brilliant insights. Thank you for your comments today. Well, that's it for the Hinckley Report. If you'd like to listen to the Hinckley Report as a podcast, please go to KUED.org/Hinckley Report and subscribe. Thank you and good night.